Hello aspirants, welcome to Vyara IAS. We were discussing about Indian polity. As part of our discussion, we had already covered preamble. Now, let's start with fundamental rights. In fundamental rights, we shall study the meaning of right, we shall study about the constitutional right, we shall study the inspiration behind having fundamental rights in our constitution in background, and we shall study about the significance or the importance of fundamental rights. We shall study whether fundamental rights are justiciable or non-justiciable and such kind of characteristics of fundamental rights. We shall also study all the types of fundamental rights that we have in our constitution. That is the list of fundamental rights. Firstly, we must know the meaning of right. Right is nothing but a kind of entitlement that is given to a person, right? It is nothing but a benefit, or else you can also define right as a claim. So, next is we have a constitutional right. So, the meaning of constitutional right is very simple. As the name says, the right that is enshrined in constitution, that is mentioned or written in constitution, is called as constitutional right. Take for example, right to vote. Right to vote is given under Article 326. So, 326 of Constitution. So, this right can be called as constitutional right. Then, what is fundamental right? Yes, fundamental right is also a constitutional right. That is, fundamental right we see under Part 3 of our Constitution. So, the rights that are mentioned under Part 3 of the Constitution is called as fundamental rights. That is, it covers from Article 12 to 35. Whereas other rights that we see in our constitution other than part 3 of our constitution are the other constitutional rights. So now we got to know where the fundamental rights is placed in our constitution, that is part 3. It starts with Article 12 to Article 35. This is about fundamental rights. Next we have is the background for having the fundamental rights. Yes, fundamental rights were derived from America's Bill of Rights. So, next we must study about the significance of fundamental rights. So, why is it called as fundamental rights? We know fundamental is nothing but basic. Yes, fundamental rights are the basic rights. This fundamental right, it covers all the human rights that are covered under Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So, that is why it is called as fundamental rights. And the other reason why it is named as fundamental, because why it is fundamental to have is because it serves the basic purpose of constitution. So what is the basic purpose of constitution? That is to limit the government. We already studied while we were studying about preamble, that is, for the government, the authority, the supreme authority is constitution, and for constitution, the supreme authority is people. So, here, the government acts as per the rules that are mentioned in constitution. So, and the constitution here, it is limiting the government. That is the basic purpose of constitution, and fundamental rights serves this basic purpose of constitution. And also, this fundamental is very essential to achieve the aims and aspirations in preamble. So, what are the aims and aspirations of preamble? That is, it is nothing but having equality, liberty, justice, fraternity. So, all this are the essential things that the fundamental rights are serving, and that is why it is called as fundamental. So, the next significance of fundamental rights is, if we see the placement of fundamental rights, I already said that fundamental rights are seen in part 3 of constitution. So, right after placing or defining, we can say, right after defining our territory, so the constitution makers placed fundamental rights. So, this shows the importance of fundamental rights in our constitution. So, the placement of fundamental rights in our constitution itself shows the significance of fundamental rights. Next importance of fundamental rights is, Supreme Court is the guardian and custodian of fundamental rights. So, that is, if the fundamental rights are violated, it is enforceable by courts, and we can directly approach Supreme Court for its protection. So, Supreme Court is the custodian and guardian for this fundamental rights, and this is very important because once previously in UPSC it was asked, the custodian and guardian of fundamental rights is was the question that was asked. So it is Supreme Court, and this shows the importance of fundamental rights. The next topic in fundamental rights is characteristics of fundamental rights. In rights, we have two types. One is justiciable and the other one is non-justiciable. The fundamental rights are called as justiciable rights because these are enforceable by courts. I had already said fundamental rights you can directly go to Supreme Court for its implementation if the rights are violated. So these are justiciable. That is, if violated, we can directly go to courts for its implementation. So that is the meaning of justiciable right. And the next thing is fundamental rights are called as the negative obligation on the state. So what is this? Why is it called as negative obligation in the state? Because this fundamental rights tells states not to do certain things, right? Because it is limiting the power of government. So it limits governments. So these are called as negative obligations on the state. That is, if the state is doing something against right to equality, so it says the state not to do it. So it is called as negative obligations. The next characteristic of fundamental right is it is not absolute in nature. That means you can't enjoy your fundamental rights just like that absolutely. There are certain restrictions to it. That is, there are certain common restrictions. That is, there are restrictions to each and every fundamental right, and altogether there are certain common restrictions to fundamental rights. That is, take for example, these are the 4 common restrictions. That is, firstly, to protect the sovereignty and integrity of India. That is, while you are enjoying your fundamental right, you are not supposed to do anything against the sovereignty and integrity of India. So that is the first restriction we have. The second restriction is, that is, to protect the friendly relations with neighboring countries. Third is to promote the public order, morality and decency. And the fourth is to promote the interests of socially and educationally backward classes. So this is about the non-absolute nature of fundamental rights. Next we have is, it is said that fundamental rights is non-permanent in nature. That is, fundamental rights are not just fixed. That is, you can make amendments to fundamental rights. You can definitely change fundamental rights as per situational demands. So the fundamental rights are called as referred to as non-permanent in nature. So one more thing that is to be kept in mind is, while making amendments to fundamental rights, the basic structure of our constitution shouldn't be changed. So what is this basic structure? We had already studied while we were discussing about preamble. So here what is to be kept in mind is, fundamental rights are non-permanent in nature. That is, you can make amendments to fundamental rights. While making amendments, you must keep in mind that the basic structure of our constitution shouldn't be changed. So that is the characteristic of fundamental right. Next is fundamental rights. Some of the fundamental rights are exclusive to citizens. That is, only citizens can enjoy those fundamental rights. And there are fundamental rights which is available to both citizens and aliens. Aliens, simply put, it is nothing but foreigners. So there are certain fundamental rights which are exclusive to citizens. So those are Article 15, 16, 19, 29 and 30. We will be studying about these articles later in our video lectures while we study about the fundamental rights in classification of fundamental rights. In the other characteristics of fundamental rights, we shall study in our later video lectures. If you like this content, please share, subscribe and like to our YouTube channel Vyara IAS. Thank you.